It started before sunrise. The city was quiet, but the streets were moving. Steel trucks rolled through alleyways, lifting bins, collecting what New York wanted to forget. For most people, it was routine. Trash went out, trucks came by, and the city stayed clean. But behind every pickup, every stop, and every envelope passed from one hand to another, there was something darker at work. This is the story of how garbage became gold. For nearly half a century, the city's private sanitation industry moved more than $1.5 billion a year. An invisible economy, unseen, unregulated, and for decades untouchable. While the rest of the city slept, power shifted in the shadows. Mob captains held sway over the trucks that kept New York breathing. Routes weren't just business. They were property, controlled, traded, and protected the same way a corner or a union was. Names whispered in indictments and headlines. James "Jimmy" Brown Failla, the Gambino captain who ran the city's biggest trade association. Alphonse Malangone, Genovese muscle in Brooklyn. Salvatore Avellino, the Lucchese enforcer from Long Island. All part of a quiet empire built on trash. By the 1990s, federal prosecutors were calling it Operation Wasteland, the campaign to take down one of the last great mafia monopolies left in America. But before the headlines, before the raids and the arrests, it started simple. A city drowning in its own refuse. And a few men who realized there was fortune buried inside every bag. Post-war New York was booming. Skyscrapers were rising, factories were running again, and the sidewalks overflowed with the byproduct of prosperity, trash. Every morning, the Department of Sanitation hauled away the city's waste. But by the mid-1950s, even New York couldn't keep up. The streets were packed, businesses were growing, and strikes by sanitation workers left garbage piling high along the curbs. City Hall had a problem and a plan. In 1956, New York privatized commercial waste collection. Overnight, 52,000 new customer accounts were handed to private haulers. Restaurants, hotels, bars, office towers, every business now had to hire its own trash company. It was meant to save the city money and ease pressure on the unions. Instead, it opened the door to something far more dangerous. Private carting meant cash payments, steady routes, and little oversight. It was a blue-collar gold rush, and the underworld noticed. Almost immediately, trade associations began to rise, neighborhood-based groups that represented the haulers. On paper, they were civic organizations. In practice, they were power brokers. Through these associations, certain men began to decide who picked up which trash, where, and at what price. At the center of it all was a name that carried weight: Vincent Squillante. He was more than a businessman. He was a protege of Albert Anastasia, the infamous boss of the Murder Inc. enforcement squad. Squillante ran the Greater New York Trade Waste Association, the biggest in the city, covering Manhattan and Staten Island. He didn't need to pull a trigger. His influence came from control. Every truck, every route, every dollar. Squillante's operation was simple but brilliant. Once a company started servicing a building, that building became its property. No one else could touch it, and if someone did, they'd pay a multiple, a cash ransom based on the customer's value, a protection racket dressed up as business. The profits were enormous. The competition disappeared, and for a few short years, Squillante was untouchable. Then, without warning, he vanished. Sometime in the late 1950s, Vincent Squillante disappeared from New York's streets. No witnesses, no body, no goodbyes. Law enforcement believed he'd been executed by his own people, either because he knew too much or because he'd taken too much. His death sent a message that echoed through the alleys and truck yards of the city. This wasn't sanitation, it was domination. And in New York, even garbage could get you killed. After Vincent Squillante disappeared, the roots didn't die with him. They were taken over, reorganized, fortified, and handed to a new generation of mobsters who knew the value of control. At the top stood James "Jimmy" Brown Failla, a Gambino captain with an easy smile and a reputation for keeping the peace his own way. Failla ran the Greater New York Trade Waste Association, the largest of its kind, representing hundreds of private haulers across Manhattan and Staten Island. To outsiders, it looked like a trade group. Inside, it was a government of its own built on silence, loyalty, and fear. Failla perfected what became known as the property rights system. Every customer account called a stop belonged to someone. Once a company picked up a building's trash, that building became their property. If another hauler tried to take it, they owed a multiple, a payment worth several months of revenue, to the man losing the stop. Those payments kept the peace, and the price is high. Competition died quietly, replaced by a network of handshake deals and fixed bids. Haulers would agree in advance who would win a contract, what price they'd charge, and how the profits would be split. If a newcomer refused to play along, trucks got burned, equipment disappeared, and warnings were delivered in the middle of the night. Murder was rare, but it didn't have to be common to keep people in line. By the 1970s, the system ran smoothly, too smoothly. The Mafia controlled the city's waste collection through what they called gentlemen's agreements. No paperwork, no threats on record, just a nod across a table, and everyone knew what it meant. Prices never dropped, customers never switched, and the money flowed like clockwork. When city officials tried to step in, they found themselves chasing ghosts. There were no contracts showing collusion, no paper trail to the mob, just an unspoken rule that everyone obeyed. In 1974, the NYPD tried something bold. They created their own carting company, a front designed to infiltrate the system and prove what everyone already suspected. For 2 years, undercover officers hauled garbage across Brooklyn, collecting evidence of bid rigging and restraint of trade. When the indictments finally came down, 55 companies and 9 individuals were charged. It was supposed to be a turning point. Instead, it became a punchline. The fines were small, $500 per truck, less than 1% of what those companies made in a month. No one went to prison, no one lost their roots. The cartel stayed exactly where it was, stronger than before. The message was clear. In New York's trash business, you could buy peace, buy silence, and even buy the law, all for less than the cost of a new set of tires. By the 1980s, the garbage racket wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. The Gambinos still ran Manhattan, but they weren't alone anymore. The Lucchese and Genovese families had carved out their own pieces of the business, expanding control into Long Island, Westchester, and New Jersey. The system was the same everywhere. Pay the multiple, respect the route, don't underbid the wrong man. If you did, your trucks might go up in flames before the week was out. Law enforcement called it extortion. The men who ran it called it respect. At the top, old power still ruled. The Commission, a council of New York's 5 mafia families, approved business, settled disputes, and kept order in the underworld. But by the mid-1980s, the law was catching up. In 1985, the Commission trials began, a sweeping federal case that charged the bosses of all 5 families with racketeering and murder. The verdicts the following year sent shockwaves through the city. Paul Castellano, head of the Gambino family, was dead, executed outside Sparks Steakhouse. Others were behind bars. For the first time in decades, it seemed like the empire might crack. It didn't. Even with the bosses gone, the routes kept running. The garbage got picked up, the envelopes kept moving, and the cartel never skipped a week. The machine was too well built, too profitable to stop. That same year, Mayor Ed Koch tried to take a swing at the system. He proposed a new plan, the Chinatown franchise, where one company would be licensed to collect trash for an entire neighborhood under city supervision. The goal was to break the cartel's stranglehold through legitimate competition. The idea made headlines, but it never left the ground. Too much pushback, too much money at stake. When Koch left office, the plan disappeared with him. By 1988, the truth was an open secret. The New York Times ran a front-page investigation called An Empire of Garbage. It reported that despite 30 years of arrests and reform attempts, organized crime still controlled the city's $1.5 billion a year waste industry. The report estimated that New York businesses were being overcharged nearly $400 million every year, all because of fixed bids and rigged prices. But few complained. Owners paid what they were told to pay, knowing that behind every bill was a warning. The streets looked clean, but the money that kept them that way was dirty. For most of the city, the garbage disappeared like magic. For the men running it, it was alchemy, turning refuse into power and silence into profit. The city had built an empire of glass and steel. The mob had built an empire of garbage. Both were monuments to control. By the early 1990s, the garbage cartel looked unshakable. The routes were still protected. The money still flowed, but under the surface, law enforcement was watching and waiting. The FBI, the NYPD Organized Crime Control Bureau, and the Manhattan District Attorney's Office began building the kind of case the city had failed to make for 40 years. Wiretaps, surveillance, and informants, all aimed at the same invisible empire. The mob itself was changing. After Paul Castellano was murdered outside Sparks in 1985, John Gotti became the new face of the Gambino family, brash, confident, and camera-ready. He brought in a new generation of soldiers, men who loved attention more than discipline. The old bosses like James Jimmy Brown Failla preferred quiet control. But the new blood, younger, faster, less cautious, didn't understand the value of silence. That recklessness opened cracks in the wall. Meetings that once stayed private were suddenly caught on tape. Associations that once hid behind trade boards were being traced to mob families. The arrogance that had kept the system running for decades was beginning to expose it. One of the first companies to see the writing on the wall was Chambers Paper Fibers, a family-run hauler that had worked in Manhattan for generations. In 1992, Chambers started cooperating with investigators. Their drivers and executives helped law enforcement understand how the property rights system worked, who paid whom, who controlled which routes, and how intimidation kept outsiders away. It was the first time an insider had opened the books. While Chambers played it straight, the rest of the industry carried on as if nothing had changed. Money still traded hands at diners in Brooklyn. Association leaders still enforced the rules. And most carters still believed the same thing, that the mob could outlast any investigation, any indictment, any reform. They didn't know the case was already built beneath their feet. Tape by tape, truck by truck, stop by stop, investigators were mapping the network. The walls that had protected the garbage cartel for half a century were finally starting to crack. The underworld still thought it was untouchable, but the truth was already in motion, and soon the storm that would bury New York's trash empire was about to hit. By the early 90s, the cartel still ran the streets, but something new was rolling into town, and it didn't speak the language of the Mafia. In 1993, a national company out of Houston, Browning Ferris Industries, or BFY, became the first corporate outsider licensed to collect New York trash. For nearly 40 years, no one from the outside had dared try. Now a Fortune 500 company was about to challenge one of the city's oldest criminal monopolies. The reaction was fast and vicious. Local haulers protested that they didn't belong. Their trade association warned that outsiders would destroy the industry. And one morning, a senior BFI manager woke up to find the severed head of a dog on his doorstep with a note in its mouth. The message was clear. Welcome to New York. Still, BFI pushed forward. They offered contracts at half the price local haulers charged. Big clients, hospitals, hotels, office towers started listening. But fear ran deep. Most customers stayed loyal to their old haulers, afraid that switching might get their trucks burned or their windows smashed. While the city watched the price war in public, something else was happening in secret. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office, led by Robert Morgenthau, had been running a multi-year undercover investigation into the private carting industry. At the center of it was Chambers Paper Fibers, the family-owned company that had quietly turned informant. Their cooperation helped law enforcement record meetings, track payoffs, and map the full structure of the cartel. In June 1995, the storm broke. The DA announced 17 indictments and 23 companies charged with racketeering, extortion, and restraint of trade. The names were familiar, men who had been running New York's trash for decades. Joseph Francolino Sr., a Gambino capo, was accused of taking over from Jimmy Failla. Alphonse Malangone, a Genovese enforcer, controlled Brooklyn and parts of Manhattan. Salvatore Avellino, a Lucchese soldier, ruled Long Island's waste routes like a private kingdom. The indictments exposed the system's entire skeleton: the trade associations, the fixed bids, the property rights network that stretched across the 5 boroughs. For the first time, prosecutors could prove that the Mafia didn't just skim from the industry, they were the industry. Headlines called it Operation Wasteland, a fitting name for what the mob had left behind, a $1.5 billion business built on fear, silence, and ash. As the trials began, the old leaders fell one by one. Francolino, Malangone, Avellino, all indicted, all linked to decades of corruption. Some pleaded guilty, others fought it out in court, but their control was finished. By 1996, the same trade associations that had ruled since the 1950s were gone. Licenses were revoked, routes were opened, and for the first time in nearly half a century, New York's trash belonged to no one, at least not in the old way. The mob had built an empire out of garbage. Operation Wasteland tore it down piece by piece. But in New York, nothing stays empty for long. When the indictments hit, the streets didn't go quiet, they just changed hands. The old bosses were gone, but the garbage still had to move. And in the vacuum they left behind, a new kind of player stepped in. By 1996, the names painted on the trucks had changed. Waste Management Inc., USA Waste, and other national giants began buying up the same routes that mob-tied haulers once fought over. To City Hall, it looked like progress, competition, transparency, professionalism. But to the men who had worked the trade their whole lives, it looked like déjà vu. The deals were bigger, the language cleaner, but the power structure felt the same. The routes that used to belong to families on Mulberry Street now belonged to corporations headquartered in Houston or Chicago. The handshake was replaced by a contract, but the meaning didn't change. Control the routes, control the market. Not everyone bought the story that the mob was gone. Outside the city, in Connecticut, a carter named James Galante was running his own quiet empire. His companies held more than 80% of the regional waste market. Investigators said he paid tribute to the Lucchese crime family, funneled cash through no-show jobs, and kept rivals out with intimidation that sounded a lot like the old New York days. It was proof that the business didn't die, it just moved down the highway. Meanwhile, a new class of professionals entered the game: waste consultants. Firms like Great Forest, Envirotron, and EcoSav weren't gangsters. They were environmental auditors, hired by big buildings to cut waste costs and check if haulers were honest. They came with calculators instead of guns. Still, they faced the same threats that once kept customers quiet. Some consultants were followed, others got warnings, don't ask too many questions. One even found himself told bluntly that accidents happen. But the difference was, these weren't mobsters with street power anymore. They were businessmen with lawyers. The intimidation that once ruled through fear now looked desperate, outdated. By the end of the decade, the New York City Trade Waste Commission had cleaned house. Hundreds of haulers were denied licenses, forced out of the business, or sold off to national firms. The Mafia's grip had finally broken, but as the industry consolidated under billion-dollar corporations, a new question lingered. Had the city really cleaned up its trash? Or had it simply traded blue-collar rackets for white-collar monopolies? The faces changed. The suits got better, the money still moved, the garbage never stopped. By the end of the decade, the city that once ran on fear was running on paperwork. New laws required background checks, financial disclosures, and full transparency for every hauler who wanted a license. The New York City Trade Waste Commission was created to do what decades of police work couldn't: strip the mob out of sanitation, one company at a time. They called in the owners, one after another, and went through their records line by line. If you'd ever paid tribute, done business with a made man, or sat down with the wrong association, you were finished. Dozens of companies lost their licenses overnight. Trucks were parked, routes reassigned, names scraped off doors. The cleanup had finally reached the cleaners. For the first time in nearly 50 years, the old guard was gone. James Jimmy Brown Failla, the Gambino power behind the Greater New York Trade Waste Association, was dead. Salvatore Avellino, the Lucchese enforcer who ruled Long Island's waste routes, was behind bars. Alphonse Malangone, the Genovese captain who controlled Brooklyn, had fallen too. 3 families, 3 decades, all brought down by the same business they'd once owned from the curb to the courthouse. But the end didn't feel like victory. For the men who'd watched the industry rise and rot, it was more like a slow fade, the sound of engines dying out in the distance. A half-century of corruption had turned a public service into one of organized crime's most dependable revenue streams. And now that revenue belonged to someone else. The mob was gone, but the rhythm never changed. Trash still went out at midnight, trucks still rolled before sunrise. Money still moved, only now it traveled through banks instead of brown envelopes. We cleaned up the business, they said, but in New York, garbage never disappears. It just gets picked up by someone new. The trucks look different now. The names have changed. But the sound, that low mechanical growl in the early morning, is the same sound that's haunted New York for 70 years. Back then, the men behind the wheel were part of something bigger than garbage collection. They were the gears of a machine built on quiet deals, silent threats, and cash that changed hands before daylight. For half a century, the Mafia didn't just run the streets, it ran the city's trash, turning waste into wealth and fear into order. Today, the streets are cleaner, the ledgers are digital, the corruption wears suits and smiles instead of silk ties and gold pinky rings. But beneath it all, the rhythm hasn't changed. The trucks still roll, the money still moves. And somewhere down in the bones of this city, the ghosts of the old routes still whisper through the streets, reminding anyone who listens that in the city that never sleeps, nothing disappears.